After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him, because they saw the signs he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told the disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Now, we all have our favorite Thanksgiving or holiday traditions, and I'll never forget one of mine growing up was jumping in the car with my mom and my brother and taking the long drive up I-35 all the way to Iowa and hanging a left for Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where my grandparents and some aunts and uncles lived. I remember one Thanksgiving in particular, we were at my grandma Ellie's house, and this woman was like a spiritual giant, had a disciplined and deep relationship with Jesus. This one year when she hosted Thanksgiving, someone had the crazy idea of asking Grandma Ellie to say blessing over the meal that we were about to eat, which sounds like a nice thing. And as Grandma Ellie opened up her prayer, thanking God for all the people, the family that had gathered together that year for the meal we were about to take, things were going well until she rounded the corner and started praying for some of the things happening in the life of her local church and some of the missionaries that they were supporting overseas. And the prayer went on and on for more than 5 minutes, and we still joke about it to this day. And I'll never forget that the travesty of that day was the fact that we asked her to say the blessing after we had already all gone through and gotten our food. So as a kid, I remember sitting here, I was probably 11 or 12 years old, with my head bowed, holding hands with my family around me, and I could just smell like the sweet potatoes and the gravy and the turkey and all of the delicious food below my nose for 5 minutes. And we always teased Grandma Ellie about that day she prayed on Thanksgiving for more than 5 minutes. It was almost agonizing to go through. Now, I think the beauty of that prayer is what it's done in my life since then. I remember looking back and teasing Grandma Ellie, but the truth is that woman had a profound and deep walk with Jesus, and she cared far more about the spiritual than she did about the physical. She wasn't worried about the physical need of being hungry or craving food. She was just so excited and so overjoyed that her family was with her that she was caught up in the moment. And me as a young boy, I was just trapped looking at the physical and what I really wanted and needed, what my flesh craved. Now that day beside the Sea of Galilee, Jesus performed an amazing miracle where he feeds, it says 5,000 men, but you include their families, probably more than 20,000 people with just a few loaves of bread and a few fish that he miraculously multiplies and gives everyone their fill. But you zoom out and you look at that miracle in the context of the whole chapter of John 6, and you see that Jesus is actually making a very provocative statement. In fact, I want to read again verse 15, just so it hammers home. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountainside by himself. Jesus is making such a provocative statement in this miracle that the people want to come and take him by force and make him king. Why? Why would the people be in such an uproar? Now, John opens this chapter by saying that the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. This is a small detail, it seems, but it actually has huge meaning behind it. The fact that Jesus was performing this miracle on Passover had a huge importance. Passover for the Jews would have been the most nationalistic, patriotic holiday in their calendar. Much like the 4th of July for us here in America, but on steroids. This wasn't just a time where they celebrate their nation's identity, but where they celebrate how God had miraculously delivered their nation and given their nation the very land that they called home in that day. Passover was incredibly significant. If you turn back your Bible to the Old Testament, you look at Exodus chapters 3 through like 16 or 17 and get the whole story of what God does as he takes his people Israel out of Egypt, where they were slaves and they were captives to the Egyptians. You see the full story of Passover that they celebrate. But in a nutshell, here's what happened. God calls this man Moses to lead his people. He speaks to him through a burning bush. He convinces Moses to go before Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, and say, let God's people go. Pharaoh is reluctant, and so God sends these 10 plagues that will come and convince Pharaoh to let Israel go. The 10th one, the most severe, is that the firstborn of all the Egyptian families would die. And so the miracle of Passover is that God commanded the Israelites to slay a lamb and to take the blood of that lamb and wipe the blood over their doorposts, so that when his angel of death came over the city, it would only kill the Egyptians and would pass over the homes with the blood sprinkled on it, the homes of the Israelites. Now, they were also to eat that lamb, and they were to eat unleavened bread because they were going to leave in the middle of the night. There was no time to wait for the dough to rise as they made their bread. Now, just as God commanded happened, and Pharaoh finally relents. He says, fine, you may go. You've caused too much harm, get out of here. And he lets Israel go in the night. They begin to escape, and Pharaoh changes his mind. He chases after them all the way to the bank of the Red Sea, where God miraculously parts the waters and the Israelites walk across on dry ground. And as Pharaoh and his chariots chase after the Israelites, the waters crash back over them after Israel passes safely. And then as soon as they get on the other side of the Red Sea, they begin to wander in the desert, and God daily, miraculously provides food for them from heaven. That food was bread that literally fell each day onto the ground, and the word they called it was manna, which means, what is it? Now, I know that's a whole lot of overview of some part of our Old Testament, but I want to share it because there's so much symbolism in what Jesus is doing in John chapter 6 that ties in with what God did in and through Moses and Israel at the time of Passover as they left Egypt miraculously. Now, what we have to see is that Jesus chose to do this miracle at the time of Passover. That was a provocative statement. And it's amazing that this whole passage has everything to do with this miracle of bread. In fact, Passover had a lot to do with bread. In fact, if we read John chapter 6, starting in verse 27, do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him God the Father has set his seal. Then they asked him, what must we do to be doing the works of God? Jesus answered them, this is the work of God, that you would believe in him whom he has sent. Now, Jesus is later explaining to the people that are continuing to follow him what this miracle was all about. It's all about the bread, but not just physical bread. He's talking about spiritual bread. So as he performs this miracle, he is actually proclaiming something so much deeper. He's proclaiming to everyone present that he is the new Moses, come to set the captives free. Now, I love how John 6 ties into Exodus, because remember what I told you about Exodus. There was a clear storyline. There was a clear narrative. God commanded the people. He commanded the people to eat the bread and to spill the blood of that lamb. And then he miraculously provided a way for them across the Red Sea. And then after that, he miraculously provided for Israel in the desert that manna. Jesus, in the same way, does the exact same chain of events, but in reverse, to point to how he is the new Moses. He first, in John chapter 6, miraculously feeds all of the people, this miracle of provision, of bread. And then after that, if you read in John chapter 6, starting in verse 16, after his disciples go on ahead of them, Jesus miraculously walks out and crosses the water. There's this storm that they're up against. These expert fishermen can't make it across on their own. They rowed 3 or 4 miles. They're struggling, and Jesus comes walking on the water towards them, and they miraculously cross the rest of the way. And as soon as they get to the other side, this crowd follows them in another boat and wants to know more about Jesus, and there he teaches them. He says, don't just long for this bread. And it's in this teaching that Jesus commands the people to eat my flesh and drink my blood. So God commands them to spill the blood of the lamb and to eat the unleavened bread. Jesus commanded them to eat his bread, his flesh, and to drink his blood, which will be spilled for them. It's the same exact chain of events, but in reverse order. Again, to show Jesus is announcing, I am the new Moses. I have come to set you free. Now that is why the people wanted to grab him, and they wanted to make him by force the new king of Israel. Now in the first century, the Jews are a dominated people again. They may have their own land, but they are still in captivity under the world superpower of Rome. And it was their hope and their longing to take back their land, to have their own king, to be a sovereign nation again. And they thought, maybe, just maybe, if this Jesus has provided bread miraculously on Passover, if he has walked across the Sea of Galilee, much like Israel under Moses' leadership, crossed miraculously the Red Sea, maybe he is the new Moses come to conquer and lead us to our own freedom. And Jesus is announcing that very thing. Yes, I'm here to lead you into freedom, but not freedom from Rome, freedom from your own sin. The domination that is truly leading you is your flesh and the consequences of your sin. And so later on in chapter 6, he commands his people by saying, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. This command certainly tied into what God told Israel in Exodus to do, to spill the blood of the lamb and to eat the unleavened bread. But Jesus is commanding something very different. They get caught up thinking like, what is he talking about? This is too hard. Are we supposed to actually eat him? That's bizarre. Just like I was this boy caught in the physical of wanting to eat my food as Grandma Ellie prayed on and on. So Jesus didn't just die to set us free from our sin. He died to literally sustain us. And that's why we're called to eat and drink of him. Not physically, but to be sustained by him spiritually, be renewed by him daily, walk with him spiritually, set our eyes on the things of the spiritual. That's what he's calling us to see the world through a spiritual lens. Because I think the truth is we get so caught up in our physical existence. We get so busy trying to raise our kids and get them to soccer practice and pay the mortgage, and we worry about what our neighbors think of us, and we get caught up in ideas like envy and lust and greed, and we're so consumed by our flesh. In fact, Jesus didn't just come to set us free from the consequence of our sin. He came to set us free from our very flesh so that we can live in tune with the God of the universe. We can live by the Spirit. And that's why towards the end of the chapter, Jesus says in chapter 6, verse 63, it is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh is no help at all. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. Our flesh is of no help to us at all. We are called to live by the Spirit. And so my question for our group this week was, how can we live more in tune with the Spirit of God every day? How can we be more reminded of the spiritual in the midst of our physical and learn to die to our flesh more often? And it's why just a couple of days ago as we gathered, we took the Lord's Supper together to remind ourselves not only is Jesus our Lamb who was slain for us, not only did he die on the cross, his blood shed on our behalf, not only was his body broken, but he also is the one who sustains us and allows us to have this spiritual life with God here and now. And every time we gather, we need to remember and proclaim the goodness of Jesus' death and resurrection because he offers us new spiritual life. So the question for us to tackle this week is, how can I daily live in tune with the God who is Spirit? How can I be reminded of the spiritual in the midst of my everyday existence? How can I learn to die to my flesh, lose sight of the physical, and focus on the spiritual? It's there that life is found. And it's there that Jesus calls us to live with him.